Try to get into the mind of Sanders through these quotations. And now joining us in the studio is Jonathan Tahini. Thanks for joining us, Jonathan.
Pleasure to be here.
So your book is called The Essential Bernie Sanders and His Vision for America. You're a Sanders surrogate. I still find that word bizarre.
I'm not having his baby as far as I know.
Thank you for that. What the heck is the difference between a surrogate and a spokesperson?
Good question. I'll have to ask them. I think a spokesperson, well, on a practical level, I don't get paid for what I do. A spokesperson probably gets paid. I do this for free because of my love for what I do for Bernie. A spokesperson.
That may not be true for all surrogates. I don't know if that's.
I think most surrogates, actually for Bernie at least, do it because they really care about what he says and what he's trying to do, the political revolution and the campaign. A spokesperson probably talks directly for the campaign. On behalf of the campaign. It's a fine line.
Because one is sort of an official statement, which he might have to be accountable for.
Whereas I just blabber and
blab it. He doesn't have to take credit
I can just.
If you say something good, he can take credit. If not, he can deny
exactly.
it. Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's good. I want one of those. Let me start. The book is a kind of thematic. Here, I'm holding up the book here. We're plugging your book here.
Thank you for the promo. Very helpful.
It's a useful thing because it takes a lot of Bernie's quotes on different subjects and gives quotes. I'm not going to kind of go through the quotes of the book. We're going to talk more in general about the Sanders campaign. But let me start with something which bothered me about something Bernie did recently. And I've just been told that we'll talk about it and we'll show the clip as soon as it's ready.
Okay.
In one of the most recent debate, Bernie was asked, "Is President Obama progressive? Is Hillary Clinton progressive?" And in a couple of days earlier in the CNN town hall, he was asked a very similar question. And his answer, I thought, was kind of nuanced and smart about it, in the sense he didn't want to offend people that love President Obama or even Hillary. Well, they're progressive on some things, but on some things they're not. And with Hillary, he said, supporting the Iraq War was not progressive. He didn't find a not progressive thing as I remember about President Obama. And President Obama's become this sort of icon that you can't say anything negative about. Now, there was something contradictory in this. He has said that he has taken a pledge that his finance team will not be from Wall Street. He's challenged Hillary to make the same pledge, and she won't. On the other hand, he praises President Obama's handling of the financial crisis in 07, 08, and says President Obama saved us from the Great Recession becoming the Great Depression and so on, which there's an element of truth to. But he did it completely with the Wall Street finance team. So isn't that sort of contradictory?
Well, I would add perhaps a different perspective, another perspective, which I think that Bernie has commented on, that the Justice Department has not done its job in prosecuting the people on Wall Street.
Also,
which I think
people appointed by President Obama.
Which he has been critical of, I think, the president in the past, that all the people who have done these crimes and have this misbehavior in Wall Street not only did not lose their jobs, not only did not go to jail, they didn't lose their jobs, they're still making all these huge amounts of money and getting benefits. So I think that he's been critical about that in the past.
Yeah, but not now.
Yeah.
And not in some of these key moments where he has such a national platform. And I understand the strategy of it. He wants to be seen as a positive candidate, not a negative, and he doesn't want to be overly critical. You don't want to offend all kinds of people that like President Obama. Particularly, you're not doing well amongst African Americans, and you don't want to offend African Americans that still have have an affection for President Obama. I think that's less so now. People feel like he didn't kind of deliver much for poor African Americans, but still, he's one of us.
And I think,
but that being said, he loses some of who he is by not differentiating, I think.
Well, fair enough. I disagree in this one sense. I think that it's in his nature not to want to take people on personally in that way. And I think on the stage, he gets uncomfortable with that. And it's the reason I think he does better personally in forums as opposed to debates, when he's standing next to somebody like Hillary Clinton, who he personally seems to like. And he's uncomfortable with that. And I think he's spent enough time with President Obama that he's uncomfortable taking him on publicly in that way, whereas he might do it privately. So I get what you're saying. It's just not in his nature to be that way.
Because similarly with Secretary Clinton, you can be respectful, but you can be, and he has sometimes, he's taken quite a firm moment. But he, on this Iraq war vote of hers, he's taken her on it, but it's like the Iraq war was a war crime.
I agree.
It was illegal.
I agree.
One of the, I don't know, you can call it a mistake or part of a worldview that was really flawed, but I think one of the greatest errors, and even legally some people say a crime, is President Obama didn't prosecute Bush Cheney. And if there's anything that helped revive the Republican Party, that certainly played a big role. And, it's not just like to be so collegial with things of such gravity. You start to wonder if it doesn't make his own differentiation from Clinton a little mushy. And then she's playing on that. Oh, me and Bernie have the same values and so on.
Speaking personally, there's moments when on the Iraq War, because to me that's, as you point out, a war crime. It was the reason that I personally ran against Hillary Clinton in 2006 in the Democratic primary in New York because of her vote for the Iraq War, because I wanted to have a debate about the war. And to me that was a war crime, probably the worst foreign policy debacle in the past 20 years. And Bernie points that out, but I do think, and again, some of us would like him to do this, it's not in his nature to say, and you, Secretary Clinton, voted for the war. That's not in his nature to do that. Some people
well, then people start to wonder, I mean, presidents have to have in their nature, I mean, I still find it a little peculiar how people can praise Lyndon Johnson. I understand there was some good reformist legislation under Johnson, but the Vietnam War, I mean, the same way I can't get past supporting the Iraq War, I can't get even more past the Vietnam War. That being said, Johnson was known to be able to get what he wanted because he could pound people into it. You got to have some of that.
He has that. Just to quickly look at another example, remember the classic example of him taking on Alan Greenspan in the Senate and basically reaming him, tearing him a new one, as they say out in the street. You watch that video of Bernie Sanders versus Alan Greenspan, and to me, no person should have any doubt that he's willing to take on people of power.
He demolished Greenspan.
Demolished him.
Yeah.
And, there's few people that claim to have as much power as Alan Greenspan is seen as a figure of the elite.
Well, I'd like to ask you about something which is kind of not what your book's about at all. And not even in some ways about Bernie.
Okay.
Because if anything, the most electrifying, if you want, important historic moment is all the people rallying around Bernie and what they believe. I think Bernie has some good reformist social policy. It's, by any classical definition of socialism, it's not really socialism, but it has some socialist character, free college, healthcare for all. But the fact that he's opened up, we were talking off camera ahead of time, that millions of people are not haunted by the demons of the Cold War. They actually don't care. They can just talk about whether it's socialist or something else on the face of the policy. Did you expect this?
No, and I think it's a fantastic point that I actually believe that Bernie will win this election. But putting that aside, no matter what happens, to your excellent point, the conversation about socialism has been opened up and in a lot of ways demystified. Now, I think that I draw a line between those people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s and younger people on this question. Because younger people, they didn't go through this kind of craziness about the Cold War, about communism, about socialism. So if you're 30, 25, all you hear when Bernie talks about democratic socialism is free tuition for college, free health care, breaking up the big banks, and a whole host of things that people really want. Older people have had more of an issue with that, but I think that certainly the conversation has just been astounding. And I don't think it's become an issue in the Democratic primary. I actually don't think
I'm confusing you because I'm doing this on my ear, and you think I'm talking to you to tell you something about this in your ear. Actually, I'm telling my studio crew who are trying to give me some interesting statistic that I can work into the conversation that they need to be louder because I don't know what the heck they're saying.
Okay.
1/3 of millennials support socialism. That's what they were telling me. But I've actually seen a stat which I think was people under 30 or 35. It was actually over 50% thought socialism was superior to capitalism.
And because they've both experienced the downsides of it, and also because to them the word socialism, democratic socialism, has a warm, positive feeling. The idea of being social and connecting and sharing and spreading wealth. This all makes sense to certainly millennials and younger people. They don't have in their mind the notion of the old Soviet Union, all this crazy Red Scare that we had for so many years that we've sort of experienced.
Even democratic socialists, and certainly socialists, at the heart of socialism is who owns stuff. Now, I'm not expecting Bernie to go out and talk about what's the phrase?
Seizing the means of production.
Seizing the means of production.
Yeah.
But couldn't he be talking more about building out the public sector? Certainly, free college is sort of that. Certainly Medicare for all is that. Postal banking is that. But there's so much more.
Well, when you talk about free healthcare, that's 15% of our gross domestic product.
Healthcare's a big thing.
Huge.
Sure.
Huge, as Bernie likes to say. He does talk about infrastructure. For example, he wants to rebuild the country in a climate-friendly way. That's a social good. That's a public good.
It's a social good, but he doesn't say how he's going to spend that money. And there's a big difference of whether that's public-private partnerships or really building up the public sector to do a lot of the infrastructure building. Like, we're based in Baltimore now. And there's been program after program of public-private partnership that's just been boondoggles. It's all in the name of alleviating poverty for a social good. We're going to build the inner harbor and this tourist area, and people will flock in, and there'll be so many jobs that will start reducing poverty. Quite the contrary. A lot of developers got very wealthy, and politicians got nice contributions. Poverty's gotten far worse in Baltimore. Like, how you spend that money, and if it's going to have a socialist character to it, is one thing. If it, otherwise it's not that much different. I mean, George Bush after 9/11 had some stimulus too, and
my guess is, knowing Bernie, that he would be very conscious of that, and he wants to build up the public sector. He's always been, going back to being mayor of Burlington, and the way he developed that city. He was very, very conscious that he did it in a public sector building way, and making sure that the people who put him in office, working people, were cared for, and he adhered to those principles. So I think that on the infrastructure, I feel personally pretty confident that he would do it in the way you described.
Has he ever said so? Oh, you're saying he did do it in Burlington?
He did it in that way in Burlington.
An example of that?
The waterfront that was developed, it's incredible if you go down there. It was done low-income housing, the public controls it. There was some private development, you're right, but I do think it was mostly about developing the public sector. But it's a fair point. It's not fleshed out in the trillion-dollar infrastructure about how that would be actually executed. But what he has done is he's recognized that we can't have an economy that works for people if you don't have roads that function, bridges, and waterways.
When did you get to know him?
Probably got to know him for the first time in the mid-90s when I was doing lobbying work as a labor activist. I was a member of the United Auto Workers. I was president of the Writers Union at the time, which was affiliated with the UAW. And so I did a lot of lobbying in Washington on workers' issues. And because I came out of the Northeast, out of New York, we would often meet Bernie for lunch. He would come and speak to our gatherings. But I got to know him much better about 3 years ago when I interviewed him for Playboy magazine. And when you do that kind of interview, which is sort of probably the only place in the world that you can have a written interview that goes on for a long time. I mean, Fidel Castro has been in Playboy. Many politicians, celebrities, you get to spend hours and hours.
I know, this was a standing joke back in the day. I only read the interviews.
But what Playboy loved is that Bernie Sanders was probably the only politician that linked directly from his website to the Playboy site, to the interview. He was not bashful about it. He was proud that it was there. So I got to know him quite well doing that. And then that led me to think about creating this book when he decided to run.
Have you had a chance to talk much about his foreign policy?
In the book or in
or
general?
ever?
Yes, and principally, it comes up mostly around the Iraq War. His vote for the Iraq War, his vote against the Iraq
going
War,
to war.
against going to war, Hillary Clinton's vote for the war. That was that's the principal thing.
Because there's things that he said, and let me say with some caveat, he voted against the Iraq War on some very critical moments. He sided against, you could say, the military-industrial complex and such, although he has not, as far as I know, made any calls for really reducing the Pentagon budget. It's been more about reallocating how it's spent.
Well, I think he's also been in favor of cutting it dramatically. And
Really? I haven't heard it recently.
He talked about it, I'm pretty sure, in the last debate, but he does talk about how we should reduce dramatically the defense budget.
Maybe. But I certainly have not researched this comprehensively.
The
debate I heard was, let's not fight World War II style army. But he didn't say, let's spend less money. It was more like, how would you reallocate the money?
I think he says both, but you're right. Much of the emphasis he has put is, you should, if you're worried about terrorism, you shouldn't be putting all this money into ICBMs against a threat that doesn't exist anymore.
Right. But there's a few things he said which are kind of, I think, a reflection of a worldview. He went out of his way to praise NATO in the George Washington speech on foreign policy. I don't know why he needed to do that, but I think most progressive historians, and he's a progressive, consider NATO not to really have been a defensive organization, that there really wasn't a threat of Soviet troops marching into Western Europe and all this. If there was any threat in terms of what the look of post-European politics was, it's domestic. It was the Italian communist movement, the Greek communist movement. It wasn't some Russian soldiers coming in that NATO had to go defend against. And there's a lot more evidence that NATO was even potentially an aggressive organization. He didn't need to go out of his way to praise NATO and its role, which he did in that speech. Also, someone accused him of wanting Cuban and Venezuelan style socialism, dictatorship, and all this. And he said, well, I'm no Chavez. It was about Chavez. I'm no Latin American dictator. Which is buying into all the kind of Cold War kind of rhetoric against Chavez, which much of the Democratic Party does. And everybody knows Chavez was elected, he's died now, but he was elected, 11, 12, 13 times. So internationally observed elections that everyone said were fair and all. It's a reflection of either a misunderstanding or he's still got a bit of a few toes in the Cold War himself. What do you think?
Well, I don't know the speeches you're referring to. In other words, I haven't heard them, so it's hard for me to know the context in which you talked with him. Look, I don't think he's a Cold Warrior by any stretch of the imagination. I think his passion and what he thinks about most is inequality, the billionaires, the class warfare, if you will. And in my view, that puts him pretty easily among people who, if you had that conversation with him, would be much more in our sphere of understanding than not. I don't think, the things I've read about him, the conversations I've had with him, the idea of being a Cold Warrior, when I'm thinking about Bernie now, I'm processing this in my mind, just seems so far away from who he is.
Is it sort of electioneering stuff? You've got to say some of these key things because you don't want to inflame a certain constituency, like strategically. And maybe there's some merit in that, I don't know. I mean, I have no idea how you run and win these sort of things, and he clearly
he's doing pretty well.
He's doing pretty well.
Well, I think, one of the things he emphasizes, and I think the reason he emphasizes the Iraq War, and you have from just talking to you now, and a far better understanding of all sorts of issues that I don't think most Americans think about on a regular basis. NATO, Hugo Chavez. So Bernie has a short amount of time to talk to a public with a short attention span. They do understand the Iraq War. And they do understand the Iraq War because many of them watching have had service, family members who have died there, come back wounded. They know there's something going on over there, still conflict. If they know enough, probably that they've paid from their tax dollars to pay for that unfunded war. So I think when you have a short attention span, you can't have a seminar on foreign policy when you're talking to voters. You have to think about...
I'm not suggesting you do any lectures on Venezuela. I would say shut up about Venezuela.
I'll mention that to him when I talk to him next time.
Yeah, I mean, it is frankly too complex, but you don't need to go out of your way to kind of participate in the rhetoric.
But fair enough. I would say that what I often think is very useful when he talks to the American people, he says, "I'm for diplomacy before war," and that's a basic principle that when he sits around in the Oval Office, which I hope he will be there in a year, he'll have advisors, and that will be a basic principle that will guide him.
You were head of the Writers Union in New York.
It was a national organization, but I was based in New York.
Oh, you were the national president.
That's correct.
Oh, even better, because where I'm headed with all this. There's quite a division in the union movement about Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton. Other than the postal workers, I guess, communication workers, nurses.
Yep.
Nationally, there may be some I'm missing, but those are the big ones that have come out for Bernie.
I think that's right. I think you covered the big ones.
And most of the other a lot of the other, not all have endorsed anybody, but a lot of the other big ones, especially SEIU, have come out for Hillary. Well, it's a fairly profound division, really. It's not just about this or that candidate. Talk a little bit about what you think it is.
I guess it's one of the disturbing things for me as a labor person to see that. And the calculation I think they're making, at least they were making a few months ago before Bernie tied in Iowa and what I think he's going to do, which is win New Hampshire, their calculation was the following. The Clintons are well known for taking names and making lists for people. And if you are not on their good side, and if you are on their bad side, they will take it out on you. Bernie's not that way. And I think a lot of people in the labor movement, because frankly, a lot of the leaders are based in Washington, and I know a bunch of them, they are fairly establishment figures, and they're used to working in that circle. They want to make sure that they have access to the White House, to the Oval Office, for some practical reasons. So their calculation is the following. Look, if Hillary Clinton wins, we don't want to be on her bad side. If Bernie Sanders wins and we didn't support him, Bernie Sanders is not the kind of person that's going to say, "I'm not talking to you, go to the end of the line." Bernie's not that kind of person. He's not vicious. He doesn't, he won't respond that way.
I think there's something to what you're saying.
I think that's a practical thing.
But one is, if they're going to do it, shouldn't they extract some promise from Hillary?
We don't know what those promises,
Well, we know the promises they extracted from President Obama, which was called the Employee Free Choice Act, and he completely bailed on them. When the Democrats controlled both houses, they didn't pass it simply because they didn't want it, because they could have prioritized it, and they didn't.
The labor movement has, for many, many years, and I've been around the labor movement for 25, 30 years, has, I think, done dumb things when it comes to extracting
dumb things are because a whole section of the labor movement is just so part of that same stratum. I mean, national labor, I don't know what you got paid, but in the bigger unions, national leaders are getting paid hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, and they never spend a penny of their own money on lunches. I mean, I don't know how many Ruth Christie steaks they eat on their credit cards.
Let's stick on the policy thing, because not even the people that make what you would consider not those kind of high salaries, some of them are also supporting Hillary Clinton. So I don't think it's necessarily about the money they're making and that kind of thing. It does have to do, I think, with a sense that they are inside the Beltway, that they are inside the party politics, they're inside the party mechanism. And to your point, they don't leverage their power. Part of that, I think, is because of the division, or the way in which many leaders are far from the rank and file. A lot of union members, unfortunately, don't know what union they belong to, even when they're paying dues to the union.
It's so important. I do a little game.
Yep.
I go to hotels or a supermarket or someplace I know is unionized, and I say, "Tell me the name of your union." And I would say 9 times out of 10, they can't tell me the name of their union.
And that's sad, and I say this with no great joy, that we've, in many ways in the labor movement, we've become disconnected from the members. And I think that then reflects the choices that some leaders make. Now, I will say, most of the time when these endorsements are made, union members go, "Okay, fine, we go." There's been such outrage on the part of, for example, teachers at the endorsement of the American Federation of Teachers of Hillary Clinton, that every time their president posts something, and I happen to be Facebook friends with her, there are tons of comments from teachers basically attacking her. And I have not seen the kind of level of anger.
The SEIU locals publicly
SEIU too,
denouncing
they've
their own
rejected it,
national
and in fact,
leadership.
some of them, including in New Hampshire, have endorsed Bernie. And what I think is going to happen is that many, many activists, thousands of union activists, are just going to ignore their union endorsement, go work for Bernie, and have already worked for Bernie. So I'm trying to be positive but optimistic that people have seen from their own eyes, union activists, union members have seen who they should stand with, and it's Bernie Sanders. He is a man of the people. He's the guy who's going to stand for them. And they're rejecting, in many, many cases, far more than I've ever seen, their own union official endorsement.
I was, just before we did this interview, we ran this interview I did with 10 Sanders supporters in Maryland, most in the Baltimore area, and I asked them, if Bernie doesn't win, would you vote for Hillary? And I don't know what your guess of the answer was. 2 out of 10 said yes. 8 said they actually wouldn't vote for Hillary. They either would vote green or not vote at all. I mean, I'm not so sure how wise that is if it leads to a President Trump, but at any rate. But
I think it depends.
This division's fairly profound.
I think it depends how the campaign unfolds. I do think that Bernie will win the nomination, but if Hillary Clinton should win the nomination by getting the superdelegates to overturn...
Well, I was about to say, can he win given the way the superdelegate machine has been created?
Well, what I would say is those superdelegates are unaffiliated, but if Bernie wins the majority of the delegates in the actual votes in 50 states, and he doesn't get the nomination, they will blow the party up. And then they will see, maybe millions is an overstatement, but a huge number of people abandon the party, not vote. I don't think that they'll vote Republican, but they won't show up at the polls. So they should be very, very careful about what they do when it comes to the convention. If Bernie actually has the majority of the vote, the delegates from the actual vote of the people.
It would be a split in the Democratic Party of historic proportions.
It would blow the party up. They would lose, I think we would lose the White House. I think we would not take back the Senate. And it could cause a rift for a decade, particularly what we talked about before among young people who will have seen what they thought was a process of energizing and being involved in a campaign, and all of a sudden it's taken away from them by some backdoor deal.
But that if most of your money is coming from hedge funds and Wall Street people, and the real cash of the Democratic Party is and was Wall Street money. I once asked some union leaders, how come you guys don't leverage this more? And their answer was, well, how much leverage have you got when Wall Street's the real money here?
Yep.
So Wall Street is not going to, assuming Sanders is serious, and there's no reason to think he isn't, they are not going to let this happen, which means they do pull in their superdelegates. And or if Hillary really falters, if you watch Fox, their theory is they get the FBI investigation cooking, they sink Hillary, and in waltzes Biden. But one way or the other,
heard that.
One way or the other, the real money behind the Democratic Party, how could they let this Sanders thing happen?
But I'd say one thing to counter that most of the superdelegates, I'm not mistaken, are elected members of Congress. They're not just money people, finance people, and just hacks. They're elected members of Congress, and elected members of Congress care about one thing, getting reelected. And it's true that they get money from people financing them, but they're not going to, if there's a huge surge of Bernie supporters, they're not going to want to piss people off in their own district, who could then turn around and challenge them in a primary and boot them out of office. So it's going to be delicate. It's going to be very delicate.
It's going to be dramatic. We were talking off camera before what happened to Henry Wallace, President Roosevelt's vice president. He, at the convention, I'm sorry, I can't remember, it was 44 or 45, he was supposed to be renominated as Roosevelt's vice president, and the right wing of the party, Dixiecrats and others, essentially staged a kind of a coup, and at the last second, they actually turned off the microphone when they were going to nominate Wallace, and the next day they got Truman.
That's a great story.
And we get Truman, we get the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we get the permanent war machine.
It's amazing how if little things can change the course of history. The Supreme Court hands George W. Bush the election and steals it from the Democrats, and we get the Iraq War.
Well, actually, it's interesting you say that. I was going to kind of wind up the interview here, but there's an important point there. When push comes to shove, and this will be one of the more dramatic post-World War II electoral events, if Sanders looks like he could win, and they manipulate the convention against him, I think you could even possibly see some of the leading Democrats prefer the Republican to Sanders. Certainly the money behind some of these Democrats. You get what I would call an Al Gore moment in Florida. I think Al Gore could have called for this full revote in Florida. And there's a moment where he succumbs, and I think he succumbs because it was opening up such a window into how corrupt the political system was, and that election had been stolen. Mm-hmm. And to let that really unravel would have unraveled a lot of people's notions, mythology about America and democracy. And in those moments, I think he actually put a kind of class interest ahead of his actually own presidency. I can't prove it, but I don't know how you explain how he didn't fight harder. And if Sanders really, and it's not just Sanders, I have to say again, it's the whole movement behind him, all these young people.
If they try to do that, there will be people in the streets surrounding the convention, and I'll be one of those people if they try to seize it away from him.
In Philadelphia. All right, well, maybe we'll see you there because we'll be live from the streets.
Okay,
thanks very much for joining us, Jonathan Tahini. And I don't know if you're around the next day or two, but maybe we might be able to pick this up tomorrow.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm around till Wednesday. I'll shoot back, and Kayla knows how to find me.
Sounds great. All right, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you for joining us. We are going to throw to, what are we throwing to? We're doing what? Oh, no, I don't want to do that. No, I thought Jessica had some more interviews we were going to go to. That's what I thought we were going to go to. Don't do that? Okay, then I think, well, not everybody was around a little while ago. Can we? All right, I'll tell you what, let's do the Koch brother thing. You got the Koch brother thing there? Okay, a little while ago we showed you this, but I'm going to show it again because maybe people have just joined us. There's a film made by a journalist, investigative journalist called Bruce Livesey, and he made a film about the Koch brothers in Canada where they amassed most of their fortune. And it's about the influence of the Koch brothers on Canadian politics and on American politics, why they want the XL pipeline, why they're throwing $1 billion to elect a president that will say yes to the pipeline. And that film was supposed to be shown on global television, and the film was finished. And global television didn't show the film, and they fired Bruce Livesey. So we're going to make the film the Koch brothers didn't want you to see. And here's Bruce to explain what it's all about.
In fact, the Koch's fortune was made refining Canadian oil. Recently, U.S. President Barack Obama vetoed the
Koch Industries is one of the biggest companies in the United States. They have annual sales of like $100 billion. They have two guys that run it, David and Charles Koch, who are among the richest people in the world. They're worth individually $43 billion. And what makes the Koch brothers interesting is how they use their wealth. And they largely use their wealth for two different causes. One is to deny that climate change is a reality and is actually occurring. And the second way they use their wealth is to get conservatives elected to office who will then further their corporate interests. So the problem is that getting the mainstream media to report about these guys and what they're doing is difficult. And I can speak about that from personal experience. My name's Bruce Livesey. I'm an investigative journalist and television producer.